Cup in mind, sculptures have been placed at Qatar's iconic football stadiums. The ship, by Qatari artist Faraj Daham, stands 10 meters high. Located at the Al Janoub Stadium, which in shape was inspired by traditional dhow boats, it's yet another reminder of the connection to the sea. The mesh facade at the Ahmed bin Ali Stadium is an art piece itself.
So the design choices was talking to the theme of the region, so this is close to the desert. And the symbols of the facade of the mesh have been selected from that region. So you have the desert rose, you have the native flora and fauna, which represents one symbol. You have the shield, which represents the strength of the region. So all these symbols have a very distinct and specific meaning for that region. And that's going to be the design language of the stadium for the region.
The stadium was rebuilt for the Qatar 2022 World Cup using 80% of the materials from the deconstruction of the old Ahmed bin Ali Stadium. What's really interesting, though, is the remaining materials were recycled and repurposed into public art installations on display throughout the country during the tournament.
Steel structures have been used for public art, so there was artists, they have selected old materials from the stadium, they have integrated into their art projects which are available in Qatar, and you can see the stadium still as part of their future art.
Layla Bacha, art specialist for Qatar Foundation, stands in front of another piece commissioned specially for the World Cup, Come Together. Designed to be seen by fans visiting the Education City Stadium, it was created by Korean artist Choi Jwang-ha.
The artist was invited to come to Qatar 2 years ago, just right before the COVID, and he was inspired by Qatar in general. So the shape is like a dandelion, and that is made of 100 legs specifically, and those legs are made out of football balls, very colorful, that attracts the attention, and also to keep his visual identity of using recycling materials, he chose to have a Qatari kitchenware recycled and added to this artwork.
The whole Education City campus is full of unexpected art. But it's not just international artists. Azan, by Qatari artist Sheikh Hassan bin Mohammed Al Thani, focuses on women's empowerment. And over in Lusail, Sarah Lawler shows me the surprising piece Igal by Shukal Mana. It depicts the traditional headwear worn by Qatari men on a huge scale.
Slightly original territory there.
Yeah, lost on nobody. Yeah. And especially it's within 1 week of the election. And then 2 days later, I believe, we get the CPI report. And good luck. Try to signal anything. Yeah, on the 10th.
If you told me 75 beeps near an election, never would I ever think
it's about to happen, Tom.
Ever.
In 18 minutes' time. 18 minutes away from the Fed decision. Special coverage continues with Priya Misra of TD Securities. That conversation just around the corner. Your equity market on the S&P, negative 0.4%. From New York, this is Bloomberg.
Imagine simply climbing a cable into space. The concept is known as the space elevator. Not only could it significantly change how we leave planet Earth, but it could also completely transform humanity's relationship with space. And there are scientists who think we could have already built it.
We have the material, we have the technology, we have the lasers, we have the climbers, we have all of it. If a private entity wants to build it, or a government, they can build it. It'll change society. We have no clue how colonizing into space, how really spreading out into space will really change our society over the next 50 to 200 years. It'll be completely different.
This is a really, really tough meeting.
How much does the Fed lean into a downshift?
You look at those PMI numbers, you look at the housing numbers, you look at the slowdown in the global economy.
Maybe it's time for the Fed to at least downshift.
Eventually, the step down has to come.
Is it too early? In my opinion, yes.
The difficulty, obviously, is that the inflation numbers haven't come down yet.
Having said that, if I was sitting at the Fed right now, I would really struggle.
Ken Powell talk about slowing down the pace, but still indicate resolve on fighting inflation.
They can't take rates up at 75 basis points rate indefinitely.
All eyes will then focus on that December rate hike meeting.
Obviously, November is all about December.
The focus in the November meeting is really on December.
November is all about December. I think a lot of people agree with that right now. The decision 15 minutes away. The price action looks like this on the S&P 500. Equities are negative 0.4% on the S&P. On the Nasdaq, we're down about 0.9%. We've seen some major moves in the news conference for the Federal Reserve through much of this year. So, let's see what it looks like a little bit later.
Do they last?
Fade the next day has been the story sometimes. Let's get to the bond market. 2s, 10s and 30s look like this. The last time the Fed met, we were about 50 basis points lower than where we are at the front end. 454.48 on a 2-year. Unchanged. Yields come in about a basis point on 10s. 4.0318%. And to finish on the US dollar, let's finish with the rest of the world. The rest of the world would love this thing to be a whole lot weaker.
They're
a whole lot weaker, Tom. Without a doubt.
John, you had a great insight this morning here on the equity markets, and I went back, of course, with the research of Team Surveillance and looked at the Dow, and basically it's 32,000, 29,000, 32,000. Stocks have gone nowhere.
Since the last meeting, yeah.
Churning on. I mean, within the earnings and the surprises we've seen, some of that based on buoyant nominal GDP. We continue with the former Vice Chairman of the Federal Reserve System, Richard Clarida. Dr. Clarida, I want to speak to you about your x-axis, your timeline forward. I understand it's delicate as a current former Fed official, but the idea that we get a hold of inflation and actually get this fixed. You're talking to President Biden. Are you out to June of next year? Are you into 2024? What's the Clarida timeline look like?
Well, Tom, I think what I think of as a plausible best-case scenario is a scenario whereby through some combination of the tighter policy and some adjustments in the labor market and, frankly, some good luck, that by the end of next year, by the end of 2023, the measure of inflation the Fed looks at, the core PCE measure, is running at 2 point something. It might be 2.8 or 2.9, but it'll start with the 2. I think that's the plausible best case scenario. Unfortunately, if there's risk to that outlook, I think it's risk to the upside on inflation, because inflation now, we've seen the employment cost index, for example, a very good example, is now running at 5%. Adjust for some productivity, that means underlying inflation is somewhere in the mid-3s at best. So the Fed has work to do, and really the most difficult disinflation assignment really since the 1980s. And so what I think of as the plausible best case scenario, by about a year from now on a year-over-year basis, inflation is below 3, but a lot has to happen for that to play out.
Rich, policymakers always talk about the balance of risks, about the outlook and the next policy move. One thing we've heard from this Federal Reserve, repeatedly in fact, from several officials, and it's in the minutes from the last meeting, is that the risk of doing too little outweighs the risk of doing too much. Is that still your assessment of things as you'd be looking to set interest rates if you were back on that committee today?
Yeah, it is, John. It is my assessment because history has shown, this is not just an academic exercise, history has shown that if central banks don't have credibility and they are not able to, over time, achieve price stability, the costs of the economy are significant, and ultimately that inflation, the cost of bringing down inflation is higher. So absolutely, I am very much, if I were on the committee, I would be articulating that view, which might not make me popular with everybody, but it's what I believe.
Rich, a viewer just wrote in and said that he's been asking Piers this one question: where do you see inflation in December 2023? And he said it's been very concerning to him to see how far and how vastly different the projections are. Where do you stand? And, how concerning is it to you that people really can't pinpoint with any consensus where it will be?
Well, it is concerning because in retrospect, all of us sort of got lulled in the great moderation from, say, the mid-'90s until the global pandemic collapse. In a good year, inflation was running at 2.1 or 2, and in a soft year, 1.8, 1.6. And so we all got used to very little volatility in inflation, and it is something of a shock and a wake-up call to have to look at the uncertainty, but it is a fact of life. Now, look, it's not just in the U.S. We see a similar dynamic in the U.K., Canada, the Eurozone, Australia. So for a variety of reasons, and I think not coincidentally, due to the shutdown, the pandemic, the reopening, and now what's going on in Ukraine, there are big shocks hitting these economies, but unfortunately they're all moving in the same direction, and they're moving inflation up into levels that nobody likes.
Rich Clarida, a lot of people are looking back at other bouts of strong inflation. Originally it was back to the 60s maybe, Walter Heller and all that, but more and more people look back to the stochastic moments of the 40s into the early 1950s.
Yeah.
Do you have an enthusiasm? Do you have a belief that once the trend moves, it will move quickly to disinflation?
Well, I do think once we start to see this in the labor market, yes, I think it can be quite quick. And indeed, if you look at past cycles, wage inflation in both the early 2000s and after the global pandemic, global financial crisis, wage inflation actually fell pretty substantially once the economy slowed. In terms of your analogies, actually, sometimes I like to think about, whether or not this is more like 1951 or 1966. I wasn't around for 1951, but if you look at the data, for example, in the U.S., we had a supply shock, we had a demand shock, the Korean War, inflation went up to 10, and then the next year was at 1%. So we can have rapid disinflations.
Rich, I was on the back end of Eisenhower in 1951.
You're on the trading floor.
I was actually, me and Ace Greenberg had the tickets out long and short. Rich Clarida with us. For those of you on radio, we're thrilled to have Rich Clarida with us with his work on DSGE and other things. The only one I know who's ever read Clarida Gertler was Priya Misra.
And Priya Misra joins us
the entire paper.
Right now, the head of global rate strategy at TD Securities. Priya, fantastic to have you with us. We're about 8 minutes away from this one, Priya. What are you looking for in the statement and in the news conference from Chair Powell a little bit later?
So one word, optionality. I think all we can get from a Fed meeting typically is a sense of the reaction function. It's a data-dependent Fed. They've dropped forward guidance. I mean, we're looking for that 75 basis point hike. That's priced in. It's all about December and going forward. And can we get a sense of the threshold of at what point do they slow down the pace of hikes? At what point does the Fed stop hiking? And then at some point, at what point do they start to ease? I think if we get a sense of thresholds, or is the Fed stepping away from front loading? I mean, we've been hearing loud and clear that they're in a front loading mode, which is code word for 75. Are they about to drop front loading? The data hasn't cooperated and they don't have a dot plot. So I think it's a really tricky balancing act for Chair Powell to deliver the 75, say that inflation commitment is still very much front and center for the Fed, but that they could slow down to a potentially higher endpoint. So to invoke like the higher, upside risk to terminal rate. I think that might be one way you can try and message a slower pace, but a potentially higher endpoint. I think that's really, it's a tricky one, but I think they deliver the one hike and the 75 hike and then talk about continued hikes.
Priya, what's a bigger danger for this Federal Reserve? That they signal an overly hawkish or an overly dovish message from a market's perspective and how the market responds?
Sure. So I think the market is desperate for a pivot. Pivot, swivel, you call it whatever. The market is desperate for any sign of a downshift. Because I think the market has viewed the pace and the endpoint as intricately linked, which I think they're not. And the two, maybe it's a nuanced message, maybe very hard without a dot plot. But I think any hint that they talk about long and variable lags, or we've done a lot, or look how much the 10-year has risen, and we can slow down, I think the market's going to run with the idea that the Fed is downshifting, that financial conditions can ease, and then we'll get the Fed coming out over the next few weeks trying to, reset the message. So I think the risk is that any sign will be viewed in sort of a dovish sense.
I want to get to Richard Clarida on this. Hey, Rich, when you were putting together the statement back in the day and you're all around the table, did you have this kind of conversation? Did someone say, you know what, someone's going to think, though, Rich, someone's going to think that's a pivot. They're going to think it means X, Y, Z. We need to change it. We need to change the word. Lloyd Blankfein was talking about getting out a thesaurus over at the Federal Reserve and going through a list of words that might be more effective. How did it actually work, Rich, when you put this stuff together?
Well, the short answer is yes. The chair and the committee are very focused on making sure the communication conveys.
السلام عليكم الدراري، كتسمعوني مزيان؟ المهم اش غنقول لكم، 0.75 نقطة هذا هو الانتري اللي طلعوه. المهم داكشي كان اش غنقول لكم، كنا بغينا شوية لاكسيون زعما يطلعوا اما ب1% ولا 0.5%، ولكن اش غنقول لكم ما بغاوش نديرو لاكسيون. هذا راه طلع بان ليا البيتكوين كيف متوقع دابا طلع هو 20,711. المهم دابا حاليا الفولاتيليتي في السوق كبيره. الايثيريوم حاليا 1602 نزل ل 1528 وطلعوا عاوتاني توت سويت. المهم هذا هو، كنا نديرو عاوتاني الا كان شي نهار حاسين نديرو اللايف نعيشو المومونت اونصومبل. وما تنساوش الدراري ديروا لايك. شكرا على الدراري والدريات اللي حاضرين اليوم، تبارك الله عليكم، راكم ديما في الموعد. نضرب لكم ان شاء الله موعد في الحلقه القادمه ان شاء الله. كنقول لكم السلام عليكم، تصبحوا على خير والله المعين.